The letter arrived on the coldest night of the year. Caleb Mercer read it twice, then set it face down on the table like it might bite him. Outside, the wind was doing its worst against the cabin walls. That low, mean howl that never really stopped in Wyoming, the kind that got inside your chest and stayed there. He was 38 years old. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 11 days. The fire was dying, the cattle were dying, and somewhere in the back of his mind, something quieter than both of those things was dying too. He picked the letter back up. I am a widow with 2 children. I am not a delicate woman. I will work. I ask only that you treat us with honesty. He stared at those words for a long time, then he wrote back and said yes. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning the stagecoach was due, Caleb woke up before the sun and stood in the yard doing absolutely nothing useful for almost 20 minutes. He told himself he was checking the sky. Ranchers check the sky. It's practical. It's necessary. There's always some reason to squint at the horizon and read the clouds. But the truth was simpler and more embarrassing than that. He was nervous. He had not been nervous about anything in years, and the feeling sat in his stomach like a stone he couldn't move. He went back inside and made coffee too strong and drank half of it and poured the rest out. He changed his shirt. He changed it back. He looked around the cabin, really looked at it, maybe for the first time, and saw what a woman coming from anywhere east of the Mississippi would see. A single room with low ceilings, a table with 1 chair pulled up too close to the fire, a shelf of supplies with no particular order, and a bed shoved into the corner that hadn't been replaced since the previous owner left it behind 8 years ago. There was no mirror in the cabin. He hadn't needed one. He ran a hand through his hair and gave up. The road to Rawlins was 40 minutes by horse, and he rode it in silence, the same way he rode every road. Caleb Mercer was not a man built for small talk or ceremony. He'd grown up in a family that believed suffering was private and joy was suspicious, and Wyoming had only reinforced that instinct. The land demanded attention, not conversation. You learned to communicate with animals, with weather, with the slow language of soil and season. Human voices felt complicated by comparison, which made the question of why he'd answered that advertisement something he preferred not to examine too closely. He'd seen it in the back of the Rawlins Gazette, tucked between notices for land sales and veterinary services. Correspondents welcomed. Several respectable women of good character seek honest men of means for matrimonial purposes. References provided. He'd nearly turned the page. He'd turned the page. Then he'd come back to it 3 days later and cut it out with his pocket knife and carried it in his coat for 2 weeks before he wrote anything down. The truth, the version he'd never say out loud, was that the previous winter had nearly broken him. Not the cold, not the work, not the debt that hung over the ranch like a second sky. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January when he'd walked into the cabin after 8 hours in the field and sat down at the table and realized there was no one in the world who knew where he was at that exact moment. Not a single person. He could have dropped dead in the snow and it would have been weeks before anyone came to check. He'd sat there for a while with that thought, and something in him had shifted like a beam in a foundation that was still holding but wouldn't be for long. He didn't write to the agency because he was lonely. He told himself that. He wrote because it was practical. A ranch needed hands. A ranch needed organization. There was work a woman could do that would genuinely help the operation. He believed maybe a quarter of that. The stagecoach was late because it was always late. Caleb waited outside the Rawlins depot with 2 other men who were also waiting for women they had never met, and all 3 of them stood as far apart from each other as possible and didn't acknowledge the situation. A man named Grover, who ran a mill outside of town, kept cleaning his glasses with his shirt. A younger man whose name Caleb didn't know kept bouncing one knee and had clearly shaved in a hurry because there was a dried cut under his jaw that hadn't quite healed. Caleb stood still and watched the road. He had written 4 letters over 3 months to Eleanor Whitaker of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She had written 4 back. They were not romantic letters. He had no talent for that and hadn't pretended to. He'd written about the ranch, acreage, water sources, the condition of the cattle operation, what the winters were like. She had written about her children, her work experience, what she could and could not do. Noah was 8, Clara was 6. Their father had died of a fever 2 years prior, leaving Eleanor with debts she couldn't service on a seamstress's wages. The letters were almost entirely practical, and yet he had read hers more than once. The stagecoach appeared around the bend at 20 minutes past noon, moving slower than usual, one of the horses favoring its left front leg. It pulled up in a cloud of dust and a clatter of wood and iron, and the driver called down something Caleb didn't catch before jumping off the seat. The door opened. A woman stepped out first. Eleanor Whitaker was not what he'd imagined, which was fair because he hadn't let himself imagine much. She was medium height, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had learned to hold things in. Not cold, there was nothing cold about her, but settled, like a person who had cried all the tears available to them on a particular subject and arrived at something harder and more durable on the other side. She wore a gray traveling dress that had seen better years, and she moved with careful efficiency, turning immediately to help the children out of the coach before she fully found her footing herself. The boy, Noah, landed with a thud and immediately looked around with the specific alertness of a child cataloging a new environment for threats and interesting things simultaneously. Dark eyes. A bruise on his chin that was a week old, maybe. He saw Caleb and stared. Clara came next, smaller, quieter, holding onto the doorframe a moment too long before letting go. She had her mother's coloring, but her expression was more watchful. The kind of watchful that comes from a child who has learned to read rooms quickly because the rooms kept changing. Eleanor turned and looked at Caleb. He took his hat off. Couldn't think of anything else to do with his hands. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Whitaker." His voice came out rougher than intended. "Good trip?" She looked at him for a moment like she was deciding whether to answer that honestly. "Long," she said. "The child 2 rows ahead of us was sick for most of Ohio. I'm sorry. It wasn't your fault." They stood looking at each other in the flat afternoon light. She was sizing him up. He knew it, and he didn't begrudge it. He was a stranger she had agreed to marry. He'd be an idiot not to expect scrutiny. "The children are hungry," she said finally. It wasn't a complaint. It was information. "There's a place down the street," he said. "Not much, but it's hot food." "That's enough. I'll chat." The diner was a cramped place called Mabel's that served 3 things and served them without apology. Caleb ordered the stew for all of them without asking because it was the most substantial thing on the list, and then felt immediately unsure if he'd made a mistake. Eleanor didn't correct him. Noah asked for bread and got it. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and didn't say anything until the food came, and then she ate with the focused dedication of someone who had not been certain when the next meal was coming. That detail landed on Caleb and stayed. "How long until the ranch?" Eleanor asked. 40 minutes. Maybe less if the road's dry." She nodded. "What's the current state of the livestock?" He looked at her. Most people asked about the house first. 63 head of cattle, 4 horses, 2 working, about 20 chickens. Lost 8 cattle this past winter. 1 to illness, the others to cold. Water source? Creek runs along the eastern edge of the property. Feeds a small pond near the barn. Reliable in spring and summer. In drought years. He stopped. "In drought years," she said. "We manage." She accepted that without pressing, which he appreciated. "Garden?" "Small one. Mostly died last fall. Haven't put anything in for spring yet." She nodded. "I can do that." He looked at her again. "I grew up on a farm," she said, answering the question he hadn't asked. "I know what I'm walking into, Mr. Mercer. I'm not expecting a hotel." Noah had been following this conversation like a small, attentive court reporter. "Is there a dog?" he asked. Caleb looked at the boy. "No." "Could there be a dog?" "Noah," Eleanor said, not sharply. "It's a question," Noah said. "It's a fine question," Caleb said. He hadn't meant to say it. He looked back down at his stew. "Maybe eventually." Noah appeared satisfied with this in the way that only 8-year-olds could appear satisfied with a non-answer. Clara was looking at Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not friendly, more like she was collecting data and hadn't reached any conclusions yet. He had the uncomfortable feeling that she was smarter than him, and she was 6 years old. The drive out to the ranch was quiet in a way that felt earned rather than awkward. Eleanor sat beside Caleb on the wagon bench. The children sat in the bed behind them, looking out at the landscape. Wyoming does things to people who haven't seen it before. The scale of it, the particular brand of emptiness, the way the sky seems to exist in a proportion to the land that isn't quite right. Too much of it. A blue so pale it borders on threatening. Eleanor looked at it without comment. Caleb watched her in his peripheral vision, curious despite himself. "It's bigger than I expected," she said after a while. "Most people say that." "I don't mean the landscape." She paused. "I mean the quiet." He didn't have a response for that. It was probably the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about Wyoming. "Mama," Clara said from the wagon bed, "there are no trees." "There are some," Eleanor said. "Just fewer. Back home there were trees everywhere." "Back home is back home," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "This is a different kind of place." A silence. Then Clara. "Do different kinds of places have different kinds of birds?" "Usually, yes." "Good." The girl seemed to resolve something internally. "I'll learn the new ones." Boom. The ranch came into view from the top of a low rise, and for a moment Caleb felt what he always felt when he saw it from that angle. Something complicated and private that he couldn't name. It wasn't beautiful, not the way artists painted landscapes beautiful. It was stark. The main cabin sat low against the hillside, the wood gone gray from weather, the porch listing slightly on one end where the foundation had shifted. The barn was larger than the house, which told you everything about priorities. The corral fence needed 2 new posts. The garden plot was a rectangle of bare dirt. He'd seen it fresh-eyed through Eleanor's silence. "It's solid," she said, and he couldn't tell if she meant it. "The barn is better than it looks," he offered. "Roof holds, walls are thick." "What about the cabin?" "It's dry, warm when the fire's going." "How many rooms?" There was a pause. "1," he said. Another pause. Not as long as he expected. "We'll need to make arrangements," she said. "I've been thinking on a partition, wood and canvas, down the middle." He'd actually lain awake 3 nights thinking about it. "Children on one side. You'd have privacy." "What about you?" "I've slept in the barn before. It's not hardship." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't parse. "I'm not going to make you sleep in the barn, Mr. Mercer. We're going to be married." "I know that. I just want to be clear about what that means and what it doesn't mean yet. We are strangers." "I know that too. I'm not saying this to be cruel." "You're not being cruel," he said. "You're being sensible. It's appreciated." She looked back at the road. "All right then." Noah broke the moment from behind them. "Is that the barn? It's huge. Can I go in the barn?" "After we get settled," Eleanor said. "How settled?" "Noah. I'm just asking the definition of settled." The next several hours were a controlled kind of chaos. Eleanor walked through the cabin once without speaking, and Caleb followed her and didn't speak either. She opened the single storage cabinet, inspected the contents, rearranged 3 things without asking, which he found he didn't mind. She checked the hearth damper, tested the window latch, knocked on the floor with her heel in 2 places to check for soft spots. "The partition can go here," she said, stopping in the middle of the room. "Leaves enough space on each side." "That's where I had it," he said. "We start on it tomorrow?" "I can get lumber from town by end of the week." She nodded. "Tonight we'll make do." He helped carry the 2 trunks in from the wagon. They were heavier than they looked, especially the larger one. He didn't comment on it. She didn't offer an explanation. The children's smaller bag had a crack in one leather strap held together with a length of twine that had been knotted and re-knotted several times. Repaired, re-repaired, repaired again. He registered it without saying so. Clara had, in the meantime, walked to every corner of the cabin and was now standing at the window looking out at the yard with an expression of careful evaluation. Noah had made straight for the barn the moment no one was watching him actively. "He's in the barn," Clara announced. Eleanor closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Of course he is." She went to the door and called out, "Noah James Whitaker, you come back here right now." A beat of silence. "I'm looking at the horses," came the reply, indistinct with distance. Eleanor looked at Caleb. "I apologize." "He's fine," Caleb said. "Horses are gentle. Mostly." "Mostly?" "One of them bites, but he bites slow. Boy'll be fine. Eleanor stared at him. Then something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. The place where one might eventually appear given the right conditions. She turned away before it went anywhere. But that first night, they ate supper around the fire. Beans and salt pork and biscuits that Eleanor mixed and baked within 30 minutes of getting the fire going, which was faster than Caleb could have managed. The children ate without complaint. Noah asked if there was more. There was, and he got it. After supper, Eleanor put the children to sleep in the bed, both of them, crossways, with a blanket from the trunk. She moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done bedtime in difficult circumstances many times. There was a routine to it, small, specific things she said to each of them, her voice lower than it had been all day. Caleb stayed near the fire and looked at the wall. When she came back, she sat across from him in the chair he'd dragged over from beside the window. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the meal, and for not making today harder than it had to be." He looked at her. The firelight made her face harder to read. "You did most of the work. I mean the other kind of hard." She folded her hands in her lap. "Some men, I've heard stories from other women who've done this. Some men make the first day a proving ground, testing, seeing how much they can get away with now that you're there and your options are limited." He said nothing. "You didn't do that," she said. "I wasn't going to." "I know that now. I didn't know it this morning." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind had found its Wyoming rhythm again, that restless cold pressure against the walls. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "Why did you answer? You had other options. City, work." She was quiet for a moment. Not like she was thinking about whether to answer, more like she was deciding which part of the truth to say. The city work was drying up. Sewing wages don't account for rent and 2 children both growing fast. And I had options, yes. Other men wrote. Men who wanted a housekeeper with a marriage license attached. Men who wrote about themselves for 12 pages and asked nothing about the children. "I asked about them," he said. "In your second letter." She looked at him. "You asked Noah's age and whether Clara had her mother's health. Nobody else asked that." He remembered writing it. It hadn't felt like a significant thing to ask. He'd just wanted to know. "I don't have much," he said. "The land is in debt. This winter was hard. I can't promise you easy." "I know. I'm not—" He stopped. This was harder to say than the practical things. "I'm not practiced at company. I've been alone a long time. I don't always say the right things." "I've noticed," she said, without cruelty. "It's all right. I'm not looking for someone who says the right things. I've had a man who said beautiful things." A pause, long enough to have weight. "It didn't end up mattering as much as I thought it would." He looked at the fire. "I'm not asking for your story tonight," she said, "and I'm not offering mine. But I want you to know that I'm here because I made a decision, not because I had no choice. There's a difference." He nodded. "And the children," she said, and here her voice changed. Not softer exactly, but more direct, the way a person sounds when they're getting to what actually matters. "If this is going to work, they need to be yours, not workers, not guests, yours. If you can't do that, if you look at them and see someone else's problem, then I need to know now before it goes further." The fire was the only sound for a moment. Caleb thought about the boy running straight for the barn. He thought about the girl cataloging birds she hadn't seen yet, deciding she would learn them. He thought about the knotted twine on the bag strap, repaired over and over, not replaced, because replacing it cost something they didn't have. "I can do that," he said. He meant it, though he didn't fully know what it would cost him yet. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Whatever she found in his face, it seemed to be enough. "All right," she said. "Then we start tomorrow." Awesome. Tomorrow started at 5:30 in the morning. Caleb was already at the barn by the time Eleanor came out with the lantern, which surprised him more than it should have. She'd made coffee before she came out, and she handed him a cup through the barn door without ceremony, which surprised him further. He was 3 stalls in when Noah appeared behind him, boots on the wrong feet, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Noah," Eleanor called. "I'm helping," Noah announced. "You're in the way," Caleb said. "I'm small. Small people don't take up a lot of space." Caleb looked down at the boy. The boots were on the wrong feet, and he appeared unbothered by this. His hair was doing something inexplicable. "You know what mucking is?" Caleb said. "No." "You're going to learn." Noah learned. He was not good at it, and he complained about the smell with remarkable creativity, but he stayed. He asked questions every 4 minutes with a consistency that was almost admirable. What was this horse's name? Why did horses sleep standing up sometimes? Did cows know they were cows? What happened to the cattle that died in winter? Why did that one nail stick out there? Could they paint the barn? And Caleb answered most of them flatly and honestly, which seemed to satisfy the boy more than elaborate responses would have. Clara was in the cabin helping Eleanor with breakfast, or more precisely, standing next to Eleanor and handing her things she asked for. Caleb caught a glimpse of them through the window when he crossed the yard for water. The girl standing on a small crate to reach the counter height, serious as a small judge. The day spread out from there. Eleanor attacked the garden plot in the afternoon with a determination that made Caleb feel vaguely competitive. She turned the soil herself with the big fork, working in rows, stopping to examine the composition of the dirt, asking him technical questions about water drainage and what had been planted before. He answered honestly, including the parts that weren't flattering. She made mental notes she didn't share. He built fence in the east field and fixed the 2 broken posts in the corral. Noah spent 40 minutes helping and actually handed him nails at roughly the right times, which was something. Claire found a bird's nest in the eaves of the barn and came to find Caleb to tell him about it in careful, specific detail. How many eggs? What color? What size? She asked if he knew what kind of bird it was. "Swallow," he said. "Barn swallow. They come back every year." She processed this. "The same ones?" "Different ones, but same place." "They choose to come back here," she said, "every spring." She looked back at the barn with an expression he couldn't categorize. "I like that," she said, and went back inside. He stood there a moment longer than necessary. The wedding happened 6 days later. There was no celebration. A circuit preacher came through Rawlings that week, and Caleb arranged it through the telegraph, and they drove in on a Tuesday and stood in the back room of the preacher's house with Noah and Clara as witnesses and said the necessary words. Eleanor wore the better of her 2 dresses. Caleb wore his least worn shirt. The preacher was a thin man named Aldrich, who seemed mildly surprised they weren't more emotional about it, which suggested he hadn't done many marriages of this type. He performed the ceremony correctly and shook their hands afterward. Noah, when asked later what he thought of the wedding, said, "It was short." Clara said nothing, but she took Caleb's hand on the walk back to the wagon without being asked to, just briefly, and then let go before he had time to respond to it. He didn't say anything about it, but he thought about it for the rest of the drive home. The weeks that followed were not a honeymoon. They were an education. Caleb learned that Eleanor had 3 states, working, thinking, and asleep, with very little in between. He learned that she burned coffee approximately 1 time in 5 and never mentioned it, just made another pot. He learned that she had a voice she used for serious things and a voice she used for everything else, and the serious voice was quieter. He learned that she didn't ask for help with things she thought she could manage, which meant she occasionally made things harder for herself than they needed to be. And he had to figure out how to offer help in a way that didn't feel like criticism. He was not always good at that. There were 3 arguments in the first month. None of them escalated, but all of them were real, about water management, about the children's schooling schedule, about whether the east fence was a priority or whether the barn roof should come first. In each case, they reached a practical conclusion and moved past it without dramatic resolution. He suspected this was also something she'd learned from somewhere more difficult. Noah had decided, seemingly by decree, that he was going to be a rancher. "When I'm grown up," he announced one evening at supper, "I'm going to have a ranch bigger than this one." "Is that so?" said Caleb. "With more horses." "How many horses are you thinking?" Noah considered with great seriousness. 8. "That's a lot of horses to feed. I'll figure it out." "You probably will," Caleb said, and was surprised to find he meant it. Clara had, in the span of 2 weeks, identified 11 bird species she could not name and was pestering Caleb to get a book from town that might help. He had, without planning to, sent a letter to the bookshop in Rawlings asking if they carried any bird identification guides. It was a small thing. He didn't think about it much. But the morning the book arrived and he handed it to her, the way she looked at it, with both hands, carefully, like it might be damaged if she held it wrong, was a thing he filed away somewhere and didn't examine too closely. But it was on a night 6 weeks in that the first real fracture appeared. Caleb had come in late from the field, tired in the way that goes past the body into something deeper, and he'd found Eleanor at the table with a piece of paper that she tried to turn over when she heard the door. He wasn't a man who pried, but she'd been too quick, and whatever was on her face before she composed it was the look of someone caught holding something heavy. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing that needs discussing tonight." "Eleanor." She looked at him, and then she turned the paper back over. It was a letter from Lancaster, from someone named Dolores Whitaker, a signature he recognized as a family name from her letters. The text, which he read quickly and didn't ask to read, contained the kind of language that people use when they want to make something sound like concern, but mean something closer to judgment. "The children are so young to be taken so far. We wonder if you've considered what you're exposing them to. Has this man's situation been verified? Is the arrangement proper?" "Sister-in-law," Eleanor said, "you don't have to explain." "I'm not explaining, I'm telling you." She set the letter down. "She's not wrong to worry, I know that, but she's not worried the way she says she's worried." "What's she actually worried about?" "That I made a decision without asking permission." Eleanor's jaw was set in the way he'd come to recognize as her version of controlled anger. "That I moved her brother's children somewhere she can't see them. That I might be happy." The last word came out almost sardonic. "She wrote me 3 letters before I left. Every one of them explained very carefully all the reasons this was a mistake. Maybe she thought she was helping. Maybe." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "My husband's family never quite managed to separate me from being an outsider. I came from a different county, different background. They were polite about it. But I always knew. And now that he's gone," she stopped. "I'm not their daughter. I'm just the woman who married their son, and these are still their grandchildren." Caleb sat down across from her. The fire was low. "They can write letters," he said carefully. "You don't have to write back the same day. I know. And if they want to say something to the children, they'll come out here and say it to my face first." He hadn't planned to say that. It came out without ceremony, just a statement of fact. "That's how it works now. They go through me." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I don't need a protector," she said. "I know that. I'm not offering to be your protector. I'm offering to be—" He didn't have the right word. "Here, between you and whatever's coming from that direction, if you want." She looked at the letter, then she folded it carefully and set it at the edge of the table. "I'll write back next week," she said. "All right. You don't need to be involved in that. All right." But he saw the small tightness go out of her shoulders, and he went to put another log on the fire, because the room was getting cold, and neither of them said anything else about it. That night, he lay in his corner of the partitioned cabin and listened to the Wyoming wind moving across the plains, and he thought about the children asleep on the other side of the canvas wall, and the woman who had come from Lancaster with 2 trunks and a cracked bag strap and a letter she hadn't asked for, and the 11 unnamed birds Clara had been tracking, and Noah's 8 hypothetical horses, and the barn swallows that came back to the same eaves every spring, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Outside, the cold pressed against the walls the way it always did, but the fire was good. The walls held. And somewhere in the dark, something that had been dying slowly in him for years had, without asking permission, started to breathe again. Spring in Wyoming was never soft. It came sideways with wind that couldn't decide if it was still winter, and mud that swallowed boots to the ankle, and days that started cold and ended cold with a few warm hours in between that felt like a trick. The Mercer Ranch moved through it in the way that working land always moves through seasonal change, not gracefully, but steadily, one task replacing the next before the previous one was fully done. Eleanor had put seeds in the ground by mid-April. Beans, squash, onions, 2 rows of potatoes. She'd ordered the seeds through the general store in Rawlings using money she'd set aside from her own savings, which Caleb hadn't known about and didn't comment on when she told him. She worked the garden in the early morning before the children were fully awake, and again in the evenings when the light was still good. The dirt here was different from Pennsylvania. Drier, more resistant, the kind of soil that needed convincing rather than cooperation. She convinced it, slowly with effort, the way she did most things. Noah had developed a complicated relationship with the horses. He was not afraid of them, which was both useful and concerning. He'd named the biting one Gerald, a name the horse did not respond to and Caleb did not endorse, but which stuck anyway because Noah used it with such conviction that it became impossible to call the animal anything else. Clara had filled 12 pages of a small journal with bird sketches and observations, cross-referenced against the book Caleb had ordered from town, and had begun correcting him when he misidentified a species, which he found he did not mind as much as he would have expected. The ranch was not thriving, but it was functioning, which was more than it had done the previous winter. The cattle were steadier. The fence held. Eleanor had reorganized the supply cabinet in a way that made no immediate sense to Caleb, but which, after 2 weeks, he found saved him 20 minutes a day in searching for things. He didn't tell her that. She didn't ask. It was in early May that Eleanor first suggested they go into town together. They needed flour, salt, lamp oil, and a replacement part for the bridle that had cracked during the cold. Practical reasons. Caleb agreed without much thought, and they loaded the children onto the wagon on a Thursday morning and made the drive to Rawlings under a sky that was finally, tentatively, blue. He should have thought about it more. Rawlings was not a large town, but it was large enough to have formed opinions. It had a main street with a hardware store, a general store, a barber shop, a bank with pretensions, a post office, and 2 saloons that everyone knew about and one that people pretended not to. It had a church and a schoolhouse, and a society of women who organized things and kept track of things, and had a specific set of expectations about how a person ought to behave and what choices a respectable person ought to make. Caleb had lived on the margin of all of that for years. He came in for supplies and left. He knew people's names and they knew his, and there was a mutual, comfortable distance that suited everyone. He had not thought carefully about what it would look like to arrive with a woman he'd married through an advertisement and 2 children no one in town had ever seen. He thought about it approximately 60 seconds after the wagon pulled onto Main Street when the first head turned. Eleanor felt it immediately. He could tell by the way she straightened, which wasn't a flinching straightening, but the kind that meant she'd decided not to shrink. She sat very upright on the wagon bench and looked straight ahead and didn't acknowledge the attention. They tied the horse in front of the general store and went in, the children close behind. Herschel Mott, who ran the store, was a lean man with careful eyes who'd known Caleb for 6 years. He looked at Eleanor with the particular blankness that people use when they're constructing an impression they don't want you to see being constructed. "Mercer," he said. "Herschel." Caleb set the list on the counter. "Everything on here, when you've got a minute." Herschel looked at the list, looked at Eleanor, looked at the children. Then he looked back at the list. "Your wife, is it? I heard you'd sent off for someone." "This is Eleanor," Caleb said. Eleanor extended her hand across the counter. "Mrs. Mercer," she said with a directness that seemed to catch Herschel slightly off guard. He shook her hand with the formality of a man not sure what category she fell into yet. "Welcome to Rawlings," he said, in a tone that made the welcome mean something more like "we'll see." They were in the store for 20 minutes, and in that time 3 women came in who hadn't needed anything particular, Caleb could tell, because they left without buying much. They looked at Eleanor with the careful, consuming curiosity that people call polite interest when they want to believe well of themselves. One of them, Margaret Ames, wife of the bank manager, a woman who wore her social position like a garment she'd paid a lot for, stopped beside Eleanor at the fabric shelf and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough, "You must be the woman Caleb brought in from back east. We'd heard." Brought in sat in the air between them. Eleanor turned to look at the woman. "Eleanor Mercer," she said pleasantly. "And you are?" Margaret gave her name with the slight inflation of someone accustomed to it meaning more than it did. "And these are your children? From before?" "From before," Eleanor said. The word before was flat, not defensive, just a fact confirmed. "It's quite a thing," Margaret said, "for a woman in your situation to take such a practical approach to starting over." She smiled while saying it. The smile was doing a lot of work that the words weren't doing cleanly. Eleanor held the woman's gaze for a beat too long to be comfortable. "It is," she said agreeably. "I'm very practical." And she turned back to the shelf. Caleb, who had caught the exchange from across the room, said nothing. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't practiced at social combat. He'd spent too many years outside the arena of it, but the discomfort of it sat in him like a splinter, small and specific. In the street afterward, Noah, who missed very little, said, "That lady didn't like us." "She doesn't know us," Eleanor said. "That's the same thing to some people," Noah said. Eleanor looked at her son. 8 years old, and he already understood that. She didn't confirm or deny it. She just took Clara's hand and kept walking toward the hardware store. It got worse at the schoolhouse. Eleanor had gone to arrange the children's enrollment. The school year was still in session, and Noah especially was behind on reading, which she'd been working on at home, but which needed proper instruction. She went in alone, leaving Caleb to wait outside with the children. 10 minutes later, she came out, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was managing something rather than feeling it. "Well," Caleb said. "Mrs. Hensley will enroll them Monday," Eleanor said. She had questions. "What kind of questions?" "The kind people ask when they want to know if your children are legitimate and your marriage is respectable without saying those words in that order." Caleb felt something tighten in his jaw. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that we married legally in March through a circuit preacher, that the children's father died 2 years ago in Pennsylvania." She paused. She asked if they'd been baptized. "What does that have to do with anything?" "It has to do with the kind of person she's decided I am." Eleanor said it without heat. "I've met women like her before. She'll decide what she thinks, and then she'll behave according to what she's decided, and there isn't much that changes that." "Did she say anything to the children?" She looked at them through the window. Eleanor's voice stayed controlled. "Clara saw her. You know how Clara looks at things." He did. Clara's gaze was a quiet, comprehensive thing. "Clara looked right back at her," Eleanor said, "and didn't look away first. There was something in her voice that was almost pride, though it came with the complicated grief of knowing your 6-year-old had already learned that particular survival skill. The drive home was quieter than the drive in. Not the comfortable quiet they'd begun to develop between them, but a weighted one. Noah had exhausted himself in town and was half asleep in the wagon bed. Clara sat beside him with the bird book open in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. "I knew it would be like this," Eleanor said after a while. Not to Caleb specifically, more to the fact of it. "It'll settle," he said. "Some of it," she said. "Some of it won't." He didn't argue with that, because she was right, and he knew it. There was a particular species of opinion that didn't settle, the kind built on something structural rather than something correctable. People who thought she'd done something vaguely shameful by coming here through an advertisement, that the children were evidence of a life that should have been managed differently, that Caleb had done something vaguely foolish by sending for them. That kind of opinion generally required years to erode, if it eroded at all. What he said instead was, "You handled it well today." "I handled it," she said. "I don't know about well." "You didn't let any of them see it bother you." She looked at him with an expression that was too tired for irony. "It bothers me. It bothers me considerably." She looked back at the road. "I just don't give them the satisfaction." They rode the rest of the way in silence. When the ranch came into view, Claire closed her bird book, and Caleb noticed she only did that when she was thinking about something that had nothing to do with birds. That evening, after supper, Noah sat across from Caleb at the table with the determined expression he used when he was preparing to say something he wasn't sure would land well. Caleb had come to recognize it, the slight furrow, the way he leaned forward on his elbows. "Those people in town," Noah said. "What about them?" "They think we don't belong here." Caleb looked at the boy directly. "Some of them." "Do you?" "Do I what?" "Think we don't belong here." The fire was between them. The cabin smelled like Eleanor's cooking and lamp oil, and the particular drywood smell that came from the walls in the evening. Caleb set down the piece of harness leather he'd been mending. "This is your home," he said. "You belong here, same as I do." Noah processed this. "That's not really an answer to what I asked." Caleb looked at him. "It's the only answer that matters." Noah seemed to decide this was sufficient. He picked up the piece of string he'd been fiddling with earlier and went back to whatever knot he was trying to figure out, and the conversation was over. But Caleb stayed at the table for a long time after, and the harness leather sat untouched in his hands. It was the word home that had done it. He'd said it without planning to, and then heard himself say it, and it had been true when he said it, and that was new. It was newly true, recently true, only weeks old, but it was there. The sense that the cabin was different from what it had been, that the sounds in it were different, that the weight of silence, when it came, was not the same silence as before. There was a night 2 weeks earlier when Clara had been sick with a stomach complaint. Nothing serious, but enough to keep her awake and miserable. And Eleanor had sat with her through most of it, and Caleb had gotten up at 2 a.m. because he heard them and thought Eleanor might need something, and he'd stood in the doorway of the partitioned section and watched Eleanor hold the girl against her side and talk to her quietly about the barn swallows, describing their habits, their colors, the way they moved through the air, until Clara's breathing evened out. He'd stood there longer than necessary. Then he'd gone quietly back to his side of the partition and lain awake for a while, listening to the ranch settle around him in the dark. He thought at the time that the right word for what he was feeling was gratitude. He still thought that was mostly right. He also suspected it wasn't the whole of it, and that figuring out the rest would take longer than he had patience for. The next Sunday, without discussing it with Eleanor, he drove into Rawlings alone and stopped into Herschel Mott's store and said, without preamble, "I'd appreciate it if you spread the word that my family is settling in well, that the children are being enrolled at school, that Eleanor is a hard worker and a good woman." Herschel looked at him over his glasses. "That's not usually how you talk, Caleb." "I know." "You care what people think now?" Caleb thought about Eleanor's face on the drive home, the way she'd held it steady the whole time. "I care what they say," he said, "around my children." Herschel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, in the minimal way of a man who didn't make promises he wasn't going to keep. "I'll mention it," he said. It wasn't much. Caleb knew that. Words through a storekeeper were a thin line of defense against years of calcified judgment. But it was the thing he could do from where he stood, and he did it, and drove home through the afternoon light feeling like he'd done something slightly useful and slightly insufficient, and that both of those things were going to be true for a while. Eleanor was in the garden when he got back. She looked up when the wagon pulled in, reading the fact of where he'd been, and coming back without supplies, in the particular way she had of reading things. "Errands?" she said. "Conversation," he said. She looked at him a moment. "Anything useful?" "Maybe." He unhitched the horse. "We'll see." She went back to the garden without pushing it further, and he put the horse away. And Clara appeared from the barn with a new bird sighting to report, something with a red stripe she couldn't identify in the book. And the afternoon moved forward in the way afternoons did on the ranch, one task replacing the next, the land needing what it always needed, and the family, still awkward, still figuring out its edges, still working out what it was to each other, holding on in the only way available to it, which was together, imperfectly, one day at a time. The drought came the way bad things often come on the plains. Not suddenly, but so gradually that by the time you were certain it was happening, it had already been happening for weeks. June started dry. That wasn't unusual. But July came in without a single significant rain, and the creek that fed the eastern pasture dropped 2 feet in 3 weeks, and the grass in the far field went from green to yellow to a pale, exhausted brown that crackled underfoot. Caleb noticed it the way a rancher notices everything, not with alarm at first, but with the steady, watchful attention of someone who has learned to read the land like a language and is starting to see words he doesn't like. By the 3rd week of July, he was certain. By August, everyone in the county knew. The well held, barely. The pond near the barn shrank to a shallow, muddy thing that the cattle stood around in confusion, as if waiting for someone to explain the situation. Caleb began rationing water with a precision that left no margin. He tracked every bucket, every trough fill, every gallon directed toward the garden against the gallon directed toward the livestock. The calculations occupied him from before sunrise to well after dark, and he did them quietly, alone, in the way he'd always done hard things. Eleanor watched this for 2 weeks before she said anything. They were at supper, beans again, because beans stored and stretched, and Eleanor had become efficient with them in a way that made them almost varied, when she set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "Show me the numbers," she said. He looked up. "What numbers?" "The water accounts, the feed calculations, whatever you're doing in your head at 4 in the morning when you think I'm asleep." She folded her hands on the table. "Show me." "I'm managing." "I know you're managing. I'm asking you to let me help manage." She said it without frustration, just clarity. "I kept accounts for 3 years when my husband was sick. I understand ledgers, and I understand that you're doing math in your head that would be easier on paper with 2 sets of eyes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and brought the notebook from the shelf, a battered thing with his notations in it, cramped and practical, and set it in front of her. She studied it in silence for several minutes. He ate his beans. Noah watched both of them with the particular attention he gave to adult interactions he suspected were important. Clara was reading her bird journal. "You're losing ground on the east herd," Eleanor said finally. "I know. If the creek drops another foot, I know. Then we need to move the east herd to the north pasture now before it comes to that. Share the well water, concentrate the animals closer. North pasture doesn't have enough grass. It is more than the east field will in 3 weeks." She looked at him. "You know I'm right." He did know. He'd been circling that conclusion for days, reluctant to commit to it because it meant additional work. He wasn't sure his body had left in it after 6 weeks of drought management. But Eleanor saying it plainly made the reluctance feel like stubbornness rather than strategy. "We moved them this weekend," he said. "I'll help." "It's hard work, yes. I know what hard work is." She picked her spoon back up. "Noah can help too. He's old enough to manage a flank." Noah's head came up sharply. "I can definitely manage a flank," he said, with the confidence of someone who was not entirely sure what managing a flank involved, but was absolutely committed to finding out. They moved the herd Saturday. It was brutal work in the heat. The cattle were stressed and reluctant, and the dust was thick enough to taste. Eleanor rode one of the working horses for the first time, something Caleb hadn't expected, sitting the saddle with the economical posture of someone who had learned young and hadn't forgotten. Noah ran the left flank on foot, shouting and waving his hat with enormous enthusiasm and approximately 60% effectiveness. Clara stationed herself at the gate to the north pasture and opened and closed it with precise timing, which was genuinely the most useful position in which she had correctly identified and assigned herself without being asked. By late afternoon, the herd was relocated. All 3 of them were covered in dust and sweat, and nobody complained, which told Caleb something about each of them. That evening, after the children were asleep, Eleanor came and sat on the porch steps where Caleb was doing the thing he often did at night, sitting with coffee going cold in his hand, looking at the land in the dark. She sat 1 step below him, which put them at nearly the same height, and looked out at the same darkness. "The garden's going to need a decision soon," she said. "I know. If I stop watering the beans and the squash and focus everything on the potatoes, we'll lose variety but keep volume. The potatoes will last the winter. The beans won't." "What do you want to do?" She was quiet for a moment. "I want it to rain," she said. "But since that's not a decision I can make—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "The potatoes." "Yeah," he said. "The potatoes." They sat with that for a while. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It had the specific weight of people acknowledging a hard thing together without making it worse by talking about it too much. Caleb had spent years believing that carrying hard things alone was a form of strength. He was slowly revising that. The first time he saw Wade Barrett was 3 days after the herd move. Barrett owned the ranch that bordered the Mercer property to the south, a larger operation, more established, with a crew of 4 hands and water rights that Caleb had always been quietly envious of. He'd had minimal contact with the man. Barrett kept to himself, which Caleb had respected as the same quality he valued in himself. He'd heard things. That Barrett had a short temper, that he'd had disputes with 2 other neighbors over fence lines, that he was the kind of man who believed acreage and tenure gave him a particular kind of authority. But rumors in ranching country were frequent and inconsistent, and Caleb hadn't weighed them heavily. He revised that assessment the morning he found his east fence cut. 3 sections, clean cuts, not an accident. The cattle he'd just moved wouldn't wander back through. They were in the north pasture. But the message was clear enough. Someone had walked along his fence line with wire cutters and made a deliberate statement. He repaired the fence that day without saying anything to Eleanor. But 2 mornings later, he found 2 of his remaining Eastfield cattle wandering the road that ran between his property and Barrett's, confused and agitated. Someone had opened the gate they definitely hadn't opened themselves. That evening, a rider came from Barrett's place. Not Barrett himself, a hand named Cutter, a lean, sun-damaged man who delivered messages the way some men delivered blows, economically and without apparent feeling. He said that Barrett was concerned about the water situation in the county, that the creek which fed both properties was becoming a contested resource, and that Mr. Barrett would appreciate a conversation about how the Mercer property intended to manage its water usage going forward, given the new, he paused in a way that wasn't accidental, additions to the household. Caleb told him to tell Barrett he was welcome to come himself if he had something to say. Cutter left without expression. What did that mean? Eleanor asked. She'd been in the garden, but had seen the rider come and go. It means Barrett's decided this drought is an opportunity, Caleb said. Opportunity for what? To push. He looked toward the south fence line, which was out of sight past the rise. He's been looking at this property for years. His water rights are better, but my acreage is good land. If the drought pressures me enough, he thinks you'll sell. He thinks I'm weak, Caleb said. Always did. Man alone on a failing ranch. Easy target. He paused. He needs to adjust his thinking. Eleanor studied him. And how do you plan to make him do that? Hold the line, he said. Don't give him anything to use. That plan held for exactly 8 days. Barrett came himself on a Tuesday morning when Caleb was 2 miles out in the far field checking the remaining water situation. Eleanor was in the yard, the children at school in town. She heard the horses before she saw them. Barrett and 2 of his hands, coming up the road with the deliberate casualness of men who believed their presence was itself a kind of pressure. Barrett was a large man, heavy-set in the way of someone who had been physically powerful younger and hadn't entirely lost it. He had a rancher's face, weathered, direct, with the specific blankness of someone who had made a practice of not showing calculation while calculating. He stopped his horse at the edge of the yard and looked at Eleanor with an expression she recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had expected the property to be unattended and was now reassessing. Mrs. Mercer, he said, and the way he said Mrs. had a question mark in it he wasn't quite hiding. Mr. Barrett. She didn't move from where she was standing, midway between the cabin and the barn, which turned out to be the right place to stand if you wanted to make it clear that neither building was undefended. My husband isn't here. I can see that. He looked around the yard slowly, the way men do when they want you to feel surveilled. Came to talk about the water situation, neighbor to neighbor. My husband handles our water accounts, she said. You're welcome to come back when he's here. I was hoping to have a more informal conversation. He smiled. It was a smile that had practice behind it. Woman to man, so to speak, more relaxed. I find formal conversations very relaxing, Eleanor said. One of the hands behind Barrett made a sound that might have been a laugh and then wasn't. Barrett's smile thinned slightly. Your husband's in trouble, he said. The drought is going to take this ranch down before winter. I've seen it happen, and so is he if he's honest with himself. I'm willing to make a fair offer on the property. More than fair, given the situation. The ranch isn't for sale. That might change. It won't. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and the yard was very quiet with the weight of what wasn't being said directly. You're a long way from Pennsylvania, he said, finally. She felt that one. She didn't let it show. I am, she agreed. I like it here. He turned his horse without another word and rode back down the road, his hands trailing behind him. Eleanor stood in the yard until the sound of the hooves disappeared, and then she went inside and sat at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and let herself be shaken for exactly 2 minutes, privately, where no one could see it. Then she got up and started supper. She told Caleb that evening, all of it, in order, without editorializing. He listened with his jaw set in the way she'd come to recognize as him managing himself. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. He come on the property? Caleb asked. Stayed at the edge of the yard. He threatened you directly? Not with words. She paused. He didn't need to. Caleb stood up and went to the window and looked out at the darkened yard. His back was to her, which was the position he used when he was working something out that he didn't want witnessed in real time. "I'll go see him tomorrow," he said. "And say what?" "What needs saying?" "Caleb?" She waited until he turned around. "Don't give him a reason. He's looking for one. If you go over there with your temper—" "I don't have a temper." She raised an eyebrow. "I have a response," he said. "There's a difference. The difference matters less than you think when the other man has two hands with him and a grudge he's been building for years." She wasn't asking him to back down. She understood him well enough by now to know that was the wrong approach. Go. Say what needs saying, but give him nothing to hold on to. He went the next morning. He was gone 3 hours. When he came back, he was unhurt, and he unsaddled the horse without speaking, and she let him have the quiet until he was ready. "He says the creek is shared resource," Caleb said finally over the noon meal. "Says if the water level drops below a certain point, he's going to claim priority rights based on his deed date, older than mine by 4 years. Can he do that? He can try. The law on water rights in this county is complicated. He knows that, and so does his lawyer." He ate for a moment. "He also said—" He stopped. "What?" "He said a man who goes looking for a wife through an advertisement isn't a real rancher. He's a man playing at it." He said it flat, like a fact being reported. Said a real rancher would have sold before it came to this and saved himself the embarrassment. Eleanor was quiet. "I told him," Caleb said, "that I'd been on this land 11 years and intended to be here 11 more, and that my family arrangements were none of his concern, and that if he cut my fence again I'd know it was him and I'd handle it accordingly." How did he take that? Badly. Caleb almost smiled. He's not used to the word no from people he thinks are beneath him. The fence was cut again 4 days later, this time 6 sections. Caleb repaired it in cold silence and said nothing, but Eleanor saw his hands when he came in. The knuckles scraped from the wire, the set of his shoulders that meant the thing he was holding was getting heavy. Then, on a Thursday afternoon when the heat was at its worst and the dust lay over everything like a second skin, Clara walked home from the road where the school wagon dropped the children. Caleb had arranged for a farm wagon that picked up rural children twice a week. And Barrett's youngest hand, a boy of 17 who should have known better, was riding along the fence line. He said something to her from the horse. Caleb never found out exactly what. Clara wouldn't repeat it, and the detail of her not repeating it told him enough about the content. What he did find out was that when Noah, who was walking beside his sister, said something back to the hand in Clara's defense, the horse was pushed forward in a way that wasn't quite accidental, and Clara stepped back quickly and went down on one knee in the road. Not badly hurt. Her palm was scraped and her dress was torn at the knee, and she had the white-faced look of a child who is holding herself together by force of will. Noah was still arguing with the retreating rider when Eleanor came around the side of the house and saw them. That evening, when Caleb came in from the field, he took one look at Clara's bandaged hand and Eleanor's face, and the word that came out of him was quiet and specific, and not one he used around children. "Where?" he said. "Caleb, where is he?" "Sit down," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, sit down." Her voice was the quiet one, the serious one. He sat because he respected that voice even when everything in him was telling him not to stop moving. She told him what had happened, all of it, and he listened, and the thing that had been building in him over weeks of fence cuts and drought, and Barrett's casual cruelty finally reached a place where the holding of it was no longer possible. He looked at Clara. She was at the table with her bird journal, not reading it, just touching the cover. She looked up when she felt him looking. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, which wasn't entirely true, but it was the answer she chose to give. "You did right," he said. "Coming straight home." She nodded. He looked at Eleanor. Something passed between them. Not words, not yet, but the understanding that the line Barrett had been approaching for weeks had now been crossed, and that what came next would not be the careful, managed response Eleanor had counseled and he had maintained. That the situation had changed in the particular way that situations change when a child ends up on the ground in the road. "I'm not going to do anything foolish," he said to Eleanor, because she deserved to hear it. "I know," she said, because she did know. But she also knew that sometimes the distance between foolish and necessary was narrower than either person in a room wanted to admit. He went out and sat on the porch for a long time in the dark. The drought held. Barrett held. The land held its silence in the way that land always does. Indifferent, patient, waiting to see what the people on it were going to do next. The creek dropped another 6 inches. The cattle were thinner. The potato plants held on with the stubbornness of things that have no alternative. And Caleb Mercer, who had spent 11 years learning to carry hard things quietly and alone, sat on his porch in the August heat and felt the unfamiliar, complicated weight of having people inside the house behind him who he was not willing to let the world knock down. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. It was heavier than loneliness in some ways. Loneliness was simple. This was something with edges to it, something that required him to be more than he'd needed to be before, to be it specifically, to be it on purpose, even when he was tired and the land was failing and the man to the south was sharpening something Caleb could feel but couldn't yet see coming. He went back inside. Eleanor was still at the table. The children were asleep. She looked at him when he came in, and she didn't ask the question, and he didn't give the answer, and they sat together by the low fire while the Wyoming night pressed against the walls. Outside, somewhere in the distance, the first low rumble of something moved across the sky. Neither of them mentioned it, but both of them heard it. The rumble Caleb and Eleanor heard that night was not thunder. It was the particular acoustic trick the Wyoming plains sometimes played in late summer. Sound carrying from distances that had no business carrying sound. Pressure systems moving in the upper atmosphere that rattled windows and unsettled animals without delivering anything. The cattle were restless through the night. Caleb checked on them twice. The sky stayed clear, ungenerous, full of stars and no water. By morning, the drought had its 11th week. He didn't talk about Barrett at breakfast. Eleanor didn't bring it up either. There was a quality to their silences now that had evolved over the months. Some silences were avoidance, and both of them knew the difference. But this one was more like an agreement to let the thing sit until there was something actionable to say about it. They'd both slept poorly. Clara had dark circles. Noah ate his breakfast with unusual quietness, which was its own kind of alarm bell. Noah without words was Noah processing something he hadn't found the language for yet. School day. Eleanor put them on the road for the wagon pickup, watching from the porch until they were out of sight. Caleb watched her watch them and said nothing. The day went the way drought days went, all maintenance and triage, moving resources from one failing situation to another. He reinforced the north pasture fence where 2 posts had gone soft in the dry ground. He hand-carried water to the section of cattle farthest from the trough because they wouldn't move in the heat. He checked the well depth again with the rope and bucket and marked it on the cabin wall beside the previous week's mark, and the distance between the marks was not enough to feel good about. Eleanor worked the garden in the morning and then walked the south fence line in the afternoon, which he found out when he crossed the east field and saw her returning, hat in hand, hair coming loose from the pins, checking the wire with her eyes the way he'd taught her, looking for cuts. "Anything?" he called. "Clean," she called back. "Today." He nodded. They both knew today was the operative word. The children came home from school and something was off with Clara immediately. She was quieter than her usual quiet, which was saying something, and she went directly to the barn rather than the cabin, which was what she did when she needed space to think without being observed. Noah came in and dropped his bag and said, to no one in particular, Jimmy Alcott told Clara her mother bought a husband because no real man would want her. The cabin went very still. Eleanor had her back to the room. She was at the stove. Caleb saw her shoulders stop moving for a moment. "What did Clara say back?" Caleb asked. "Nothing," Noah said. "She didn't say anything. That's how I knew it really got her." He sat down at the table. "I told Jimmy his face looked like a boot heel, but I don't think that helped." "It didn't help," Eleanor said quietly, still facing the stove. "No," Noah admitted. He cried a little, which made it more complicated. Caleb pushed back from the table and went to the barn. Clara was in the corner stall, not near the horses, just sitting on a hay bale with her bird journal closed in her lap. She looked up when he came in with the expression she used when she was trying to decide whether to let someone pass the wall she'd built. He sat down on the hay bale across from her, not next to her, across, which gave her the option of the space between them. "Noah told you," she said. "Yeah." She looked at the journal. "It's not the worst thing anyone said." "I know." He leaned his elbows on his knees. "Doesn't make it better." She picked at the edge of the journal cover. A nervous habit he'd noticed before, her hands doing something small when her mind was doing something large. "Is it true?" she said. That the way she came here means something bad about her?" "No." Jimmy said, "Jimmy Alcott is 9 years old and repeating something he heard from someone who doesn't know your mother." Caleb looked at her directly. "Your mother is the hardest working person on this property, and that includes me, and I am working myself close to the bone. She came here because she made a decision, a practical, careful decision, for you and your brother. That's not weakness, that's the opposite of it." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were dry, which meant she'd already done whatever crying there was somewhere private. "What about you?" she said. "Jimmy said you couldn't get a real wife, so you bought one." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I answered an advertisement," he said. "Your mother answered one too. We wrote letters to each other and decided, based on those letters, to try something difficult together." He paused. "I'm not sure what a real wife is supposed to mean. Your mother's real. She's the realest person I know." Claire thought about this with the thoroughness she brought to everything. "She works harder than you," she said finally. "She does," he agreed. "Don't tell her I said so." Something shifted in Clara's face. Not quite a smile, but the same shape as the one her mother occasionally didn't quite show. She opened the bird journal to a page near the middle and looked at it. "I identified the red-striped one," she said. "It's a Cassine's finch. The stripe is actually a cap, not a stripe. The book was describing it wrong, or I was reading it wrong." "Which was it?" "I was reading it wrong," she said, "but I'd like it noted that the description was also not very clear." "Noted," he said. He left her there a few minutes later, having accomplished nothing in particular and somehow having accomplished enough. He went back to the cabin and looked at Eleanor, and she looked at him, and he said, "She's okay." And Eleanor turned back to the stove, and he could see from the set of her shoulders that she was holding something in, and he stood near her for a moment, not touching, just near, and then went back out to finish the evening chores. That was the last quiet evening for a long time. The storm came 4 days later. It came the way the worst Wyoming storms come, with false warning and then no warning at all. The sky went green in the west at mid-afternoon, which meant something specific to anyone who'd lived on the plains long enough, and Caleb looked at it from the east fence line and felt his stomach drop. He started back toward the ranch at a run. He was shouting before he reached the yard. "Eleanor, get the children inside." She was already at the cabin door looking at the sky. She'd seen it too. "How long?" "An hour, maybe less." He went straight to the barn. "I need to get the cattle to the high ground on the north pasture before it hits. The low field will flood." "You can't move 60 cattle by yourself in an hour." "I know that." "Then what?" "I'll get what I can." He was pulling the saddle already. "Bar the windows, get the lanterns filled. If the creek rises, it'll take the east fence first, so don't go near it." "Caleb, please," he said, which was not a word he used easily. She went. What happened in the next 2 hours was the kind of thing that strips the unnecessary away from a person and shows you what's underneath. Caleb got 12 cattle to the high ground before the sky opened. Not 60, 12. He was trying to push the east group when the rain came sideways, not falling so much as being driven horizontally by a wind that had apparently been waiting for weeks to express itself. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the space of minutes. The ground, which had been cracked and hard from drought, couldn't absorb water fast enough, and the runoff started almost immediately, streams finding the low places becoming channels, the channels becoming the kind of moving water you didn't walk into. He'd been wrong about the timeline. It had been 40 minutes. The creek jumped its banks in the dark, which he heard rather than saw. A sound like the land itself exhaling, a low surge and rush that meant the east fence was already underwater. He turned his horse and pushed for the barn, and the horse didn't want to go, which was the horse's correct assessment of the situation, and he pushed it anyway. He was coming around the side of the barn when the beam caught him, part of the old lean-to structure on the barn's north side, wood that had been marginal for 2 years, and which the wind now decided it was done tolerating, came down in a section, and the edge of it caught Caleb across the left shoulder and side, and the force of it knocked him off the horse and into the mud. He lay there for a moment assessing the situation. The rain was extreme. The mud was cold. His shoulder felt like something had been rearranged in it. His ribs, when he breathed, produced a sharp, specific complaint. He got up. This took longer than it should have. He got the horse into the barn, which required both arms, and produced the specific consequence of finding out exactly which movements his damaged shoulder did not forgive. He tied the horse. He put his back against the barn wall for 30 seconds, breathing through the rib thing, getting his bearings. Then the barn door opened and Eleanor came in with a lantern. She stopped when she saw him. The lantern swung in her hand, throwing moving shadows. "I heard the wood come down," she said. "I'm fine." She crossed the barn in 6 steps and held the lantern up to his face, and he could see in her expression the exact calculation being made. How bad, what kind, what needs doing now. "Your shoulder. Something's off in it, not broken." He was fairly sure it wasn't broken. "Where are the children?" "Cabin. I told them to stay." "Good. We need to check. We need to look at your shoulder." "Eleanor, I have 2 hands and you're working with 1, she said flatly. "That makes me a more useful person in the next several hours than you, if we don't address the shoulder now." She set the lantern on the post hook. "Take the coat off." He took the coat off, which required a vocabulary of pain he kept internal. She examined his shoulder with efficient, impersonal hands, pressing, rotating slightly, watching his face. He held his face still. "Not dislocated," she said. "Separated, maybe. Something strained that shouldn't be." She looked at his side. "Ribs?" "Probably just bruised." "Probably," she said, in a tone that meant she didn't entirely believe him, but was filing it for later. She took the scarf from around her neck and constructed a rough support for his arm without asking his opinion on it, tying it efficiently. "This will help. Don't use the arm more than you have to. There are cattle in the low field. How many?" "Maybe 40. She looked at him. Rain hammered the barn roof. Through the gaps in the siding, the lightning made everything white for fractions of seconds. "You can't get 40 cattle to high ground alone and one-armed in this," she said. "I can try." "Caleb." She said his name the way she said things she needed him to actually hear. "Some of them are going to be lost tonight. That's the truth. We protect what we can reach and we grieve the rest after." She held his gaze. "That's what you'd tell me if our positions were reversed." He knew she was right. He also knew the debt he carried on those cattle, which she also knew, and which made the calculation cruel regardless of its correctness. "Noah and I can manage the barn," she said. "I need you to tell me what I need to do. You're not sending Noah out in this. I'm using Noah inside the barn. He's big enough." She handed him the lantern. "Come on, tell me what needs doing, and we do it together." What followed was the longest 4 hours of Caleb's recent life, and several of the most recent years had been competitive for that title. Eleanor had, at some point while he'd been in the field, moved the chickens from the coop to the interior barn stall, which was either very good thinking or luck, and turned out to be the difference between having chickens and not having chickens, since the coop, by midnight, had 3 inches of water in it. Noah had carried every piece of movable equipment to the high shelving with a furious, silent industry that Caleb would think about later. The boy working without complaint or request for acknowledgement, just doing the thing over and over, his small boots soaked through. Clara appeared at some point. She was not supposed to be there. She was supposed to be in the cabin. She appeared in the barn doorway with her hair plastered flat and her expression completely composed, holding 2 feed buckets, and said to her mother, "The water is coming under the cabin door on the east side." Then, as if she hadn't said something alarming, "Where do you need these?" Eleanor looked at her daughter for 2 seconds. "Feed storage, upper left, then go back inside." "The water." "I heard you. We'll handle the cabin. Go back." Clara went back, but she was in the barn again 20 minutes later with dry towels from somewhere and didn't say anything, just left them on the shelf and disappeared, and Eleanor chose not to address this logistically. It was near midnight when the wind began to shift. Caleb was in the far end of the barn, doing what he could one-armed with the large equipment, when he heard a horse outside that wasn't his. He went to the barn door and opened it, and the rain was still going but lighter, the leading edge of the storm passed, and through the dark he saw a figure on horseback at the edge of the property. It took him a moment to recognize Barrett. The man was alone. No hands. Just himself on a horse that was as soaked and wretched as anything else on the plains that night. He sat there without coming closer, and Caleb stood in the barn doorway, and they looked at each other across 30 yards of mud and rain and months of hostility. Barrett looked different. Something about the way he was sitting, less of whatever it was he usually carried, that deliberate weight of a man used to occupying space like a statement. "My east barn's down," Barrett said. His voice came flat across the rain noise. "Half of it. Took 2 of my horses." Caleb said nothing. "Lost half my cattle in the low field." Barrett looked at the Mercer barn, still standing, watermarks on the base, but the structure holding. Something crossed his face that Caleb couldn't quite read in the dark. "Your barn's up." "Still up," Caleb said. A silence. The rain fell between them. "I saw your woman," Barrett said, "earlier through the field, moving cattle in the storm." He stopped, started again, differently. "My wife would never." He said it without context, without explanation, as if completing a thought he'd been having alone for a while. "I buried her 7 years ago. She would never have—" He stopped again. Caleb waited. Barrett shifted in the saddle. He looked like a man who had found himself somewhere he hadn't planned to be and was trying to figure out how he'd gotten there. "The way I've handled this, the fence, the visit to your—" He didn't finish that sentence. "My hands went too far with your girl. I heard about it after. I'm not—" He made a sound. "I told Cutter he's done on my property." Caleb looked at him. "That why you came over here in the middle of the night in a flood?" "No." Barrett looked at the barn again, looked at the dark cabin where a lamp still burned in the window. "I came because my barn's down and my cattle are in your north pasture, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you'd have a reason to leave them there, let them drown or drift." He looked at Caleb directly. "You'd have the right to." "How many head?" Caleb said. 20 maybe, 25. Caleb thought about her shoulder. He thought about Eleanor in the barn working alongside Noah. He thought about the debt on his own cattle he couldn't afford to lose. He thought about Clara in the road with the scraped palm. "They'll stay in the north pasture till morning," he said. "Come collect them when it's light." Barrett sat with that. "Why?" he said. "Because they're cattle," Caleb said. "They didn't do anything." Another silence, longer this time. "The fence," Barrett said. "I'll pay to repair it." "Yes, you will." "The water rights. I may have overstated my legal position." "You did." Barrett nodded slowly, a man eating something that tasted exactly like what it was. "Your wife," he said, and this time the word wife had no question mark in it. "She's—" He seemed to give up on the sentence and just look somewhere that wasn't quite Caleb. "You've got something here," he said finally. "That's all I'm saying. You've got something I was trying to take, and I'm not sure I understood what it was until tonight." He turned the horse and rode back through the dark. Caleb stood in the barn doorway for a while after he'd gone, the rain down to a drizzle, the lightning moved east, the creek somewhere in the dark settling back toward itself. His shoulder ached, his ribs ached, the mud was cold up to his ankles. Eleanor came to stand beside him. She'd seen the rider from inside the barn. "Barrett," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." "What did he want?" Caleb thought about how to answer that. "I think he wanted to see if we were still standing," he said, "and what it looked like." She looked out at the dark. "Are we?" He looked at the barn behind them, the cabin with its lamp burning, the cattle in the north pasture that had made it through the night. He looked at the woman standing beside him in mud-soaked boots, with someone else's scarf holding his arm together, her hair wrecked, her hands rough from 4 hours of storm management, not beautiful in any storybook sense, and entirely herself. "We're still standing," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "We lost some cattle." "I know. We'll count in the morning." "Yeah." She turned to go back inside. Then she stopped. Without turning around, she said, "You scared me when I heard the wood come down and you weren't at the barn door." He didn't have a good response to that. "I got up," he said. "I know you did." She was quiet for one more second. "I'm glad you got up." She went in. He stood in the doorway a little longer, looking at the place where Barrett had been. The plains were the same as they'd always been. Flat, dark, indifferent, enormous. But the barn was standing. The lamp was on in the cabin. And somewhere on the other side of the canvas partition he'd built on a Thursday in March, Two children were asleep after one of the hardest nights any of them had gotten through together. The storm had taken things. It had also shown him things. He wasn't sure how to hold both of those facts yet, but they were both true, and he stood with them in the Wyoming dark until the cold finally drove him inside. The morning after the storm was the kind of quiet that only comes after violence. Not peaceful, relieved. The difference matters. Peaceful is something earned over time. Relieved is just the absence of the thing that was hurting you, and it has a specific quality, like a held breath finally let go, raw at the edges. Caleb was up before first light. His shoulder had stiffened overnight into something that communicated its displeasure with every movement, and his ribs had moved from sharp complaint to a dull, permanent background noise that he worked around. He dressed slowly and went out to count what the storm had left him. The east fence was down in 4 sections where the creek had overrun it. The lean-to structure on the barn's north side was gone entirely, which he'd known, but seeing it in daylight was different. The raw, broken wood sticking up from the mud like something interrupted. The chicken coop had water damage, but the birds were alive in the barn stall where Eleanor had put them, indignant and loud about the situation. The garden had taken a hard hit. 2 rows of potatoes were partially exposed where the water had moved the soil, and the bean plants Eleanor had already sacrificed to the drought were flattened completely, though that was a loss they'd already decided to absorb. The cattle count took him 2 hours. He went through the north pasture first, then walked the flooded sections, then checked along the creek line where animals sometimes ended up after flood events. When he finally had a number, he stood with it for a while before going back inside. Eleanor was at the stove. The children were at the table, both of them awake but quiet, reading. Noah with the almanac he'd found on Caleb's shelf and apparently decided was interesting, Clara with the bird journal, adding notes from some observation she'd made that morning through the cabin window. The domesticity of it, set against the wrecked yard outside, was something Caleb felt in his chest in a way he didn't have language for. 11, he said. Eleanor turned from the stove. She knew what the number meant. Out of 63, she said. 52 left. Barrett's cattle in the north pasture are his, so they don't count. He pulled out the chair and sat. The movement cost him. We're looking at a significant loss going into winter. Feed costs, the fence repair, the lean-to. He stopped. The banknote comes due in October. The room was quiet. Noah had stopped reading, though he was looking at the almanac. Clara's pen had stopped moving. How short are we? Eleanor said. Depending on fall cattle prices and if the remaining herd comes through healthy. He did the arithmetic he'd been doing since sunrise. $140 short, maybe $160. The number sat on the table between them like something solid and heavy. I have $42, Eleanor said. She said it simply, the way she said practical things. From before. I kept it separate. He looked at her. He hadn't known about the $42, which was a reminder that she had a private architecture to her life that she shared selectively, which was fair. That's yours, he said. We're the same household, she said. Eleanor, we're the same household, she said again, firmly, in the quiet voice. It's not a discussion. He accepted it because arguing would be both wrong and losing. That still leaves nearly $100, he said, in 6 weeks. Neither of them said what that meant. They both knew what it meant. The bank in Rawlins held the note on the property. The bank manager, a man named Aldrich Fenn, was not cruel, but he was precise. He did not extend terms without collateral, and Caleb had no additional collateral. If October came and the note wasn't met, the process that followed was a process Caleb had watched happen to 2 other ranchers in the county over the years. It was not fast, but it was certain. We sell what we can, Eleanor said. Your 2 extra saddles, the spare tack. I have some things in the trunk. You're not selling your things. I'm selling what doesn't matter more than the ranch. She met his eyes. My mother's brooch is not worth a ranch. I've known that since before I came here. He wanted to argue and couldn't find the moral ground for it. She was right in the same infuriating way she was usually right about things that cost something. They spent the next week in the specific misery of financial calculation, the kind where you add up everything available and it still doesn't reach the number you need, and then you add it up again in case you missed something, and you haven't. Caleb drove into Rawlins twice to price the saddles and talk to the livestock buyer about fall rates, which were lower than the previous year because every rancher in the county was selling storm-damaged stock at the same time. Eleanor wrote to a fabric supplier in Denver about seamstress work she could do through the mail, skilled work, pattern cutting, and fine stitching. Work that paid better than common sewing but required samples and time to establish. They were building something real, but they were building it too slowly for October. What happened next, neither of them planned or could have predicted. It started with Herschel Mott. 6 days after the storm, Caleb came into Rawlings for fence wire and found Herschel behind the counter with an expression that was doing more than a storekeeper's expression usually did. "Word's gotten around," Herschel said without preamble. "About the storm, about your place." "It'll hold," Caleb said. "I know it'll hold. That's what I mean." Herschel folded his hands on the counter. "People have been talking, Caleb, about what your wife did in the storm. Moving the cattle, working the barn, the whole of it." He paused. "And about Barrett." "What about Barrett?" "He's been in town, said some things." Herschel looked at him with the careful eyes of a man choosing words. "Said he misjudged the situation out there. Said you kept his cattle through the flood when you didn't have to." He stopped. "He didn't say it quite that gently, but that's what he said." Caleb looked at the wire spool he was holding. "Barrett talks too much." "Maybe, but people listened." He drove home with the wire and didn't say anything to Eleanor about the conversation, partly because he wasn't sure what it amounted to, and partly because hope was a thing he'd learned to handle carefully, the way you handled something that could break if you held it wrong. The first wagon came on a Saturday, 9 days before the banknote was due. Caleb was mending the east fence. He heard the wagon before he saw it, coming from the direction of town, and he straightened and shaded his eyes and watched it come up the road. He didn't recognize the wagon, which was already unusual. He knew most of the vehicles in the county by sight. It pulled up to the gate, and the man on the bench was someone Caleb knew vaguely, a wheat farmer named Stegall from the other side of Rawlings, a man he'd exchanged maybe 40 words with over 6 years. Stegall climbed down with the deliberate, unhurrying movement of older men and walked to the fence where Caleb was standing and said, without ceremony, "Brought some things, for the note." Caleb stared at him. "Don't look at me like that," Stegall said. "It's not charity. Consider it a neighbor investment. Your ranch survives. The county's better off. That's practical thinking." He reached into his coat and came out with a fold of bills. $62. It's what I can do. Caleb didn't move for a moment. Then he said, "Stegall, I can't." "You can," Stegall said. "You'll pay it back when you're able, or you won't, and either way it stays between us. I've had help in my time. Man doesn't forget." He held the bills out. "Take it, and stop making this harder than it is." Caleb took it. Stegall got back on his wagon and left, and Caleb stood at the fence holding $62 and feeling something shift in the way the morning looked. He went inside. Eleanor was sewing at the table. The fine work, the pattern samples for the Denver supplier. She looked up when he came in and immediately read his face. "What happened?" He set the money on the table. She looked at it. "Where did that come from?" "Stegall." She was very still for a moment. "The wheat farmer?" "Yeah." She looked at the money and then out the window at nothing in particular, and he could see her working through the same complicated feelings he'd just been working through. The relief and the discomfort of it. The collision between needing help and having spent your whole life being the kind of person who didn't ask for it. "We still need more," she said finally. "I know." She nodded and went back to her sewing because there wasn't anything else to do with the information yet. But Stegall was not the only wagon that came. By Thursday, 6 days before the note was due, there had been 4 more. A family named Garrett, who ran the dairy operation north of town, $31 in coins and small bills. The older Dunmore brothers, who Caleb knew had their own financial pressures, came with $20 between them and wouldn't discuss it. A woman named Ruth Farley, who ran the millinery shop on Main Street and who had been one of the women who came into Herschel's store to look at Eleanor in May, came alone in a small buggy with $17 and a jar of preserved peaches she set on the step without comment. Margaret Ames, the bank manager's wife, the woman who had said brought in at the fabric shelf, sent her housekeeper with a note that said simply, "For the Mercer property, from the Women's Aid Society. No strings, $25. Caleb counted the total twice because he didn't trust the first count. $153. Added to Eleanor's 42 and the saddle money and what the livestock buyer had given for the culled animals, they were $8 short of the note amount. $8. After months of calculations that had always landed them $100 short, they were $8 short. Noah, who had been doing arithmetic at the table while Caleb counted, looked up. "How much?" $8, Caleb said. "I have $1.14, Noah said. He said it with complete seriousness, as if contributing $1.14 to a cattle ranch debt crisis was an entirely normal thing. "It's in my boot." Caleb looked at the boy. "I was saving it for a pocket knife," Noah said. "But I can get a pocket knife later." The feeling that moved through Caleb's chest at that moment was one he had no name for and didn't try to find. "Keep your dollar," he said quietly. "We'll figure the 8. The $8 came from Barrett. He came himself the morning before the note was due. Came alone, no hands, tied his horse at the gate, and walked up to where Caleb was in the yard. He had something in his hand, an envelope, which he held out. "I heard what people are doing," Barrett said. "The collection." "I didn't ask anyone to do it," Caleb said. "I know you didn't. Barrett stopped. "Look, I owe you for the cattle. My cattle, in your pasture, through the flood. That cost you feed. I'm settling that debt." He pushed the envelope forward. "It's fair accounting." Caleb took the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a folded note on Barrett's ranch letterhead and $8 in bills. He stood there and looked at the $8. "The fence line," Barrett said. "I'll put men on it this week. Repair the sections I cut and the flood damage, too. That's my crew, my time, my materials." He said it stiffly, in the way of a man who has practiced something he is not naturally built for. "And I'm having my lawyer clarify the water rights documentation. What I told you before about the creek, I was applying it as a threat. That wasn't honest. The documentation says shared usage. We share." Caleb looked up from the money. "I'm not a good man," Barrett said. "I'm aware of that. I've done things over the years that—" He made a small, tight gesture with one hand. "I had a ranch that failed once, before this one. Lost it. I've been afraid of losing this one since the first year I had it. Fear makes people—" He stopped. "I'm not explaining it. I'm not asking you to understand it. I'm saying I know what I did, and I'm making it right where I can." "The girl," Caleb said. "Clara." Barrett's jaw tightened. "My hand's been let go. I should have dealt with that sooner. I knew what he was. I didn't care enough to act on it until—" He stopped again. "How is she?" "Fine," Caleb said. "She's 9 kinds of tougher than people expect." "Like her mother." Caleb looked at him. "I mean that as a fact," Barrett said, "not an insult." There was a long silence between them. The silence of 2 men who were not going to be friends, who had too much history for easy anything, but who were standing in a yard together with something between them that was at least honest. "Come to supper sometime," Caleb said. He said it because Eleanor would have said it if she'd been standing there, and he was trying, imperfectly, to be a better version of himself than his instincts suggested. "Not today. Sometime." Barrett looked slightly startled, like a man who had been braced for different terrain. "All right," he said. "Sometime." He left. Caleb stood in the yard for a moment with the $8 in his hand, and then he went inside and put it on the table next to everything else, and he called Eleanor in from the garden, and he counted it out again while she stood beside him. "It's enough," he said. Eleanor didn't speak for a moment. She put one hand flat on the table, steadying herself on something that wasn't quite the table. He'd seen her hold herself together through the storm, and through Barrett's visits, and through the town's judgment, and through the letter from Lancaster, and through 11 weeks of drought, and all of that she had managed without public fracture. But this small, sufficient pile of money from people who had no obligation to give it, this seemed to reach something she hadn't been guarding as carefully. "It's enough," she said quietly. And then she stood there for a moment, not moving, not crying, just absorbing the fact of it. They drove to Rawlings the next morning, all 4 of them, on the bench and in the wagon bed, and Caleb took the note money into the bank and placed it on Aldrich Fenn's desk in full and received the marked receipt that meant the property was clear for another year. Fenn counted it twice, because he was that kind of man, and Caleb let him count it and sat with his hands on his knees and said nothing until Fenn was done. "Surprised you managed it," Fenn said. He wasn't being cruel. He was a man of accounts, and the accounts had looked bad. He was simply saying a true thing. So was I, Caleb said. He folded the receipt and put it inside his coat, against his chest, which was not a sentimental gesture, but was. He walked back out into the Rawlings Main Street where Eleanor was waiting with the children, and he held up the receipt and she looked at it and then looked at him, and he thought she was going to say something important, and what she said was, "Noah lost his hat." "I didn't lose it," Noah said from somewhere behind her. "I put it down." "Putting something down isn't losing it." "It's in the alley," Clara said, pointing, already walking toward it with the efficiency of a person whose brother had been losing things since before she could remember. Caleb put the receipt back inside his coat and laughed. It came out rough and unpracticed, the way things come out when they haven't been used in a while. But it was real, and Eleanor heard it and turned to look at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, open, unguarded, like she'd forgotten to hold the things she usually held. He'd been married to her for 8 months. He'd seen her exhausted, incompetent, and angry, and worried, and carefully controlled. He had not seen her look at him quite like that before. It was the kind of look that required you to already know someone, and the understanding that she already knew him, that they had somehow, without planning it, arrived at knowing each other, moved through him slowly and settled. They ate at Mabel's because it seemed right. The same cramped diner, the same 3 things on the menu. Noah ordered the stew and asked for extra bread and got it. Clara sat with her hands folded and then unfolded them when she noticed she'd folded them because she'd apparently decided that was too formal for the occasion. Eleanor ordered the chicken and ate it without commenting on the quality, which was a form of grace. Caleb looked around the table. He did it without making it a moment. Just looked, the way you look at something you want to have clearly in your memory, in case. 8 months ago, this table had 1 chair pulled up to it. He had not known these people. He had known the specific, echoless quality of rooms that were only his, rooms where nothing moved unless he moved it, where silence was total because he was the only one there to make noise. That was gone. Irreversibly, completely gone, and he did not mourn it for a single second. On the drive home, with the plains opening up around them and the Wyoming sky doing its enormous pale thing overhead, Eleanor sat beside him on the bench and the children were in the back, Noah asleep despite the road's roughness, Clara watching the land go by with that steady cataloging attention. The receipt was in Caleb's coat. The ranch was theirs for another year. "What do we do about next October?" Eleanor said. Not anxiously, practically. She was always thinking ahead. He'd come to rely on it. "We build the herd back," he said. "The 52 we have are solid animals. If spring calving goes well, we could add 18-20 head. Fall prices next year should be better. The drought's broken. The seamstress work could bring in steady money by spring," she said, "if the Denver supplier takes me on. And I've been thinking about the North Pasture, that section near the tree line. It's wasted as cattle land, but the soil's different there. I want to try a bigger garden next year, enough to sell at the Rawlings market." He looked at her. "You've been planning." "I'm always planning," she said. "You know that." He did. "We'll need a second set of hands eventually," he said. "Someone to help with the herd." "Noah in a few years," she said. "Noah in a few years," he agreed. From the wagon bed, Clara's voice. "I want to learn the horses, the real work, not just riding." "You're 7, Eleanor said. "I'll be 8 in March." "That's still young." "Caleb started ranching at 14, Clara said. "That's only 6 more years." Caleb glanced back at her. She was looking at him with that level, collected gaze. "How do you know when I started ranching?" he said. "You told Noah. Noah told me." He turned back to the road. 6 years is about right, he said. "We can start you earlier, on the basics." "Caleb," Eleanor said. "She'll be useful," he said. "You know she will." Eleanor looked at him. Then she looked at her daughter. Clara was already back to watching the landscape, satisfied, done arguing because she'd already won. Eleanor made a sound that was not quite exasperation and not quite fondness, but lived somewhere between the two. The ranch came into view from the top of the rise the way it always did, low and gray-wooded and stark against the hillside. The barn still standing, the lean-to's absence a gap on the north side that would need to be rebuilt before winter. The east fence repaired by Barrett's crew 3 days earlier, straight and tight, in a way that showed the work of people who knew what they were doing. The garden plot bare from the drought, but already turned for fall, Eleanor having worked it over last week in the particular forward-thinking way she had. preparing for the season after this one. They pulled into the yard and unhitched the horse and did the evening chores in the comfortable, inefficient overlap that family life is actually made of. Caleb at the barn, Eleanor to the cabin to start the fire, Noah awake now and underfoot and helpful in the approximate sense, Clara feeding the chickens with the solemnity she brought to all tasks. The sun was getting low, Wyoming light going that particular direction where everything's warm for 20 minutes before it's cold again. After supper, when the children were settled, Caleb sat on the porch steps in the cooling air. His shoulder was better, still tight, but functional. His ribs had stopped their constant commentary and now only weighed in on sudden movements. The worst of things were behind him, and the things ahead were difficult but shaped differently, like problems with solutions attached, rather than problems that just kept compounding. Eleanor came out and sat on the step beside him. Not below, the way she had that first porch night months ago. Beside. He noticed it and didn't say so. The plains were dark now, the first stars coming in, the wind doing its usual patient work. Somewhere out in the north pasture, the cattle were settled and breathing. The fence held. "I want to ask you something," Eleanor said. "Ask. What do you think about this year?" She paused, choosing what she meant. Not the ranch, not the debt. What do you think about what it turned into? He thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. He thought about the letter he'd read in the cabin last winter while the fire was dying, the practical, unsentimental words of a woman he'd never met who said she would work and asked only for honesty. He thought about a stagecoach arriving in Rawlings and a woman stepping out who looked like she'd already survived several things. He thought about a boy on the wrong-footed boots asking about Gerald the horse, and a girl who decided she'd learn all the new birds in a new place because that was the choice available to her. He thought about the drought, and Barrett, and the storm, and the money on the table, and 8 men and women who owed him nothing putting their savings into an envelope for reasons that had less to do with him specifically and more to do with what Eleanor had shown them was possible. He thought about standing in the barn doorway after Barrett left, looking at the lamp in the cabin window, feeling the particular specific weight of not being alone. There was something he'd spent years believing about strength, that it was a solo thing, a private architecture you built inside yourself to replace the parts of you that had been hollowed out by hard circumstances. That needing other people was a structural weakness, a crack you patched over and didn't look at too directly. He'd been wrong. Not entirely wrong. There was something true in the idea of being able to stand on your own. But the complete version of strength, the version that could actually last, was something different. It was the thing Eleanor had shown up already knowing and that the year had taught him, that surviving alone is possible, but it makes you smaller, slowly, the way drought makes the land smaller, drying it out from the inside until there's less of it than there used to be. What he'd had here, this year, what they'd built between them, with no map and no guarantee, and more difficulty than either of them had been prepared for, was not smaller. It was the opposite. "I think," he said slowly, "that I was doing survival wrong before." She waited. "I thought the goal was to need as little as possible," he said. "Fewer needs, fewer weak points, simpler to manage." He looked at the stars coming in. "I don't think that anymore." She was quiet for a moment, then, "It's a reasonable mistake." "Is it? You were alone a long time," she said. "You adapted. That's not stupidity. That's what people do." She paused. "I adapted too. After Thomas died. I got very good at not needing things I couldn't have." She picked at a thread on her sleeve, yet the nervous hands thing, the small movement when the mind was doing something larger. "I almost didn't write back to you. I had 3 other letters I hadn't answered, men with better situations on paper." He looked at her. "You asked about the children in the second letter," she said. "The others asked about my cooking." "That's a reasonable thing to ask." "It is," she said. "But you didn't." She looked down at the thread. That meant something. The wind moved through the grass in the dark, the sound that Wyoming makes when it's not being violent, low and continuous, like something breathing. The stars were fully out now, more of them than people who hadn't lived in open country could quite believe. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. He was not a man built for elaborate declarations. He'd established that in the first letter, and it had apparently been acceptable, so he worked with what he was. "I'm glad you wrote back," he said. I'm glad you came. I'm glad the children came. She held his gaze. In the 8 months he'd known her, he'd learned to read the specific geography of her face, where the held things lived, where the real things showed up when she stopped managing them. He could see both right now, the thing she was holding and the thing underneath it that was real. I'm glad too, she said. He reached over and took her hand. It was rough from the work, the garden and the fence wire and the storm. She didn't pull it back. They sat like that for a while without talking, looking at the same dark that Caleb had looked at alone for 11 years, that had no memory and no preference, and that simply was, that would be there after all of them were gone, indifferent and enormous and entirely unable to diminish what had been built under it. Inside the cabin, Noah was probably not asleep yet and was probably reading the almanac by the low lamp he'd learned to position just right. Claire was most likely writing in the bird journal. She'd spotted something from the wagon today that she'd been visibly impatient to document. They were noisy and complicated and expensive and changed everything about how the days ran and what the cabin sounded like and what it meant to come in from the field at the end of the day. He would not trade any of it, not the hard year, not the drought or the debt or Barrett or the frozen faces in the Rawlings General Store, not the canvas partition or the cold mornings or the arguments about fence priorities and water management, not any of it. Because the hard year was not separate from what they'd built. It was made of it. The difficulty was not the obstacle to the life. The difficulty was how they'd learned each other, tested the thing between them, found out what it was worth. Turns out it was worth quite a lot. The Wyoming night pressed around the cabin and the land breathed in the dark, and somewhere out in the north pasture the cattle were warm and settled. The east fence held. The barn stood. The receipt was folded in Caleb's coat, and the coat was on the hook behind the door, and the door was part of the house, and the house was theirs. Eleanor's hand was in his. That was enough. More than enough. More than a man who had once sat at an empty table and understood with sudden cold clarity that no one in the world knew where he was. More than that man had known how to want. He'd learned how. That was the whole of the story, and it was sufficient.